The following episode of Frontlines was recorded on the morning of Thursday, October 26, 2023.
Real Agriculture presents Frontlines, Geopolitics Affecting Agriculture with Jacob Shapiro of Cognitive Investments and Real Agriculture's Shaun Haney.
Welcome to another episode of Frontlines with Shaun Haney and Jacob Shapiro of Cognitive Investments. Jacob is based in New Orleans, Louisiana. Hey, Jacob, great to have you back here and doing some more geopolitical chat.
Good to be with you, Shaun. I can't imagine what we're possibly going to find to talk about today.
Yeah, okay. So last time we focused a lot on what was happening between India and North America. That situation has, I guess, settled down to a certain extent, I guess, at least from a mainstream perspective, most likely probably because what has happened in Israel. We probably should start there. For a lot of us, we don't know a lot about the history of what's at play here. We do know that the different sides here, this goes back a long time. This isn't something new. What triggered this to, and I'll use the word flare up, but I'm understating what's happened here, but for this to be reignited?
Yeah, well, I mean, the problem with this topic is we could literally go back thousands of years if you want to really get to the bottom of the issue. I'll also just say that this is a conflict that seems to generate more emotions than other conflicts in the world, and I recognize that, and I just want our listeners to know that if you want someone to come on and tell you how to think or what to feel, there are plenty of other people out there doing that. Some of them even have the last name Shapiro. There's a famous other Shapiro out there who loves to do this. That's not what I'm here to do. I'm here to try and give you some objective thoughts about this. And whether you agree or not, I trust that people are intelligent enough to make up their own minds. I think when you're thinking about this latest conflict, you really have to think of it in terms of Israel's decision in 2005 to withdraw from the Gaza Strip. So Ariel Sharon was prime minister of Israel at the time, and he decided he was just going to take Israeli settlers out of the Gaza Strip. And if you go back to that time period, you will find videos of the Israel Defense Forces dragging Israeli settlers out of the Gaza Strip because Sharon unilaterally wanted to pull out. Now, he probably wanted to do the same thing in the West Bank. His health failed him, and I forget if it was a stroke or a heart attack or both, but he basically fell ill and incapacitated before he could complete it. And there was nobody either powerful enough or sort of with his strategic view that wanted to continue the project in the West Bank. So that's when you have this division between the situation in the Gaza Strip, where there are no more Israeli settlers, where the West Bank still has Israeli settlers. Then at the same time, the Palestinians held elections for themselves, democratic elections for themselves that the United States was for, Israel was for, and they elected Hamas. And so the entire sort of democratic Western world went, well, we didn't mean you could choose them, like it's democracy, but you don't get to choose anybody. And so that caused this cleavage between the Palestinians themselves to where Fatah, secular party, took over the West Bank. Hamas takes over the Gaza Strip after this little mini Palestinian war. And then in the context of all this, you also have the Israel-Hezbollah war in 2006, where Israel performs relatively poorly, in part because it's not willing to go in with ground forces. It tries to knock out Hezbollah with its air force. Now, ever since that moment, basically the Gaza Strip has flared up with violence, multiple times since the disengagement, but never to this extent. It was always firing rockets, or maybe they attacked the border crossing or something like this. But it was a real increase in Hamas's capability here, where it looked meticulously planned. They apparently knew where Israeli intelligence buildings were and ways to paralyze the IDF from responding quickly. And also the IDF was distracted. They were focused more on the West Bank. They were focused more on the northern border. The defenses were just a lot weaker than even Hamas probably expected. And that's why you got into the situation where Hamas was able to break through, kill hundreds, if not thousands of people, kidnap hundreds of people, etc. And the last thing I'll just say that makes this, I think, different and emotional for people is that a lot of this was caught on video. I mean, as somebody who started off by telling you I'm cold and objective and all these other things, I wasn't for the first few days because I forced myself to watch a lot of those videos because I thought it was my job to understand what was going on. And they're traumatic. I mean, it's screwed my head, and I deal with all kinds of terrible things all the time in the world. So I think it's really one of the first conflicts where we have these heinous, despicable things happening on video, and that's continuing now. Look at some of these Israeli strikes inside the Gaza Strip, and we have video of the aftermath, and it's all grisly and horrible and making people feel terrible. Sudan has been in a civil war for months now. I think the death toll is approaching 10,000. Nobody's talking about that. Nobody's, staying up late at night worrying about that because it's not in your face. It's not on Twitter. It's not on YouTube in your face. So I think social media here is also exacerbating a conflict that already has people feeling intense emotions.
My perception is I'll use the comparison to what's happening in Ukraine. That you and I have talked about that quite a bit. Even though we know it's happening, it still feels very far away. And there's been impacts in North America. We got fertilizer shortages coming out of Russia. We can talk about the tariffs, but it's a long way from us. The situation in Israel, it feels, and probably there's an influence here from the United States in just how close the U.S. is to Israel. It feels like this one is much more close to us and explosive, where like this could turn into something much larger, much more catastrophic. Maybe we got Iran, we got the U.S. Very flammable. Is that a fair perception, or am I incorrect?
The first part of your question is almost impossible for me to answer. So I'm Jewish. I have family members in Israel. I get why it's an emotional conflict for me. It literally does hit close to home. I have never understood, though, the dread fascination of the world with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Like I said, and I'm not doing comparative suffering here. I'm not in that business. But there are several terrible conflicts happening around the world at any given moment that are also terrible. I mean, look at what Azerbaijan just did in Nagorno-Karabakh and with Armenia. I just mentioned Sudan. I mean, you look around the world, terrible things are happening, but we'd probably need a psychoanalyst to explain why the Israeli-Palestinian conflict feels that way in people's minds. I've never quite understood it. The second part of your question, though, is much easier to answer because it is explosive in a way that the Russia-Ukraine war was not. Go back to the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war. What was one of the first things the United States did? It pulled out its embassy staff in Kyiv. NATO wasn't going to come to Ukraine's rescue. That was very clear. That was one of the reasons the Russians went in. They thought all they had to do was defeat the Ukrainians and they'd conquer it. And if they'd been able to defeat the Ukrainians, they would have. That was the mistake that everybody made, that the Ukrainians were going to fight back and push them back. But the United States, NATO, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, they washed their hands of the Ukrainians and said, no, we're not going to go in and defend them personally. My favorite report from that time was when the Germans, a couple of weeks before Russia's invasion, declared they were going to send 10,000 military helmets to Ukraine. Whoop-de-doo. Like that was the level of sort of investment that the West had in that conflict at the time. That's not true in this conflict. So you have Iran, which has proxies on the ground in Syria, which supports the Assad regime, which has a proxy in Hezbollah on the border, which has sort of cooled relations with Saudi Arabia, but that's a long-term rivalry. You have Turkey, which President Erdogan has put a lot of credibility on the Gaza issue and on the Palestinian issue for years as he tries to make Turkey a leader of the Muslim world. You have Egypt, which is broke and has to depend on Saudi Arabia, but also borders the Gaza Strip, used to rule and administer the Gaza Strip before the Israelis took it from them in the wars in 67 and 73. So you put all that together, you can see an escalatory scenario in a way that you couldn't with Russia, Ukraine. NATO and Russia, everybody was very clear. This was a Russian war of conquest against Ukraine, and those were sort of the battle lines. I think it's still the most likely scenario is that this remains an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, maybe an Israeli-Palestinian plus, some Iranian factions. But the thing that makes this conflict explosive and scary is, well, what is Iran going to do here? Are they going to see Palestinians getting killed by the tens of thousands in Gaza, or see Israel going after Hezbollah and say, okay, we have to do something to help our proxies? We're going to block the Strait of Hormuz. We're going to try and knock out, global oil flow for a couple of days to make people know what's going on. Or we're going to activate other militias and capabilities that you don't know about. Is Saudi Arabia going to respond in kind? Is it going to cut off relations with Israel? Is the United States, which is sending a second carrier battle group to the region, are they going to go in on the side of the Israelis and force all the issue? You can see the scenario building up. So I don't think it's the most likely scenario. And The one saving grace here, I think, is that almost every single actor in this, except for maybe Hamas, doesn't want a regional war. But you can see sort of the building blocks to the conflict in a way it wasn't really there in the Russia-Ukraine war. That was really more of a bilateral issue between Russia and Ukraine from the start.
Yeah. Now, I've heard coverage of prior to this happening again, there was a treaty being negotiated between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and they're being pushed back against that. Is that a fact? Do you believe that's a factor here?
Well, many countries in the Arab world, and this started really the Trump administration was pushing this, especially under Jared Kushner. This was the thing that Jared Kushner was doing with his shuttle
Yeah, I remember
diplomacy.
that. Yeah.
They got some Arab states. So Egypt and Jordan recognized Israel and did that in the 80s and the 90s for different reasons. But they got other Arab states like the UAE, like Morocco, countries like this to recognize Israel for the first time, because most Arab states in the region didn't recognize Israel's existence. And Saudi Arabia was the big one. That was the one they really, really wanted. And the Saudis played hard to get with the Trump administration. The Biden administration wanted it too. But I was talking to an Israeli analyst on my own podcast a week ago, and he made a good point to me. He said, don't think of this in terms of Israel and Saudi normalization. This is really about U.S.-Saudi normalization, because ties between the United States and Saudi Arabia have been frayed for a while. We can go into why if you want. And one of the things that the United States wants from Saudi Arabia is recognition of Israel, because the United States is trying to build this alliance network, and they want Saudi Arabia and Israel to be friends, because that makes their alliance network stronger. And Saudi Arabia is saying, okay, well, we'd like a defense treaty with the United States, and we'd like U.S. approval of civilian nuclear programs, and we'd like all kinds of investment from the United States too. So there are those discussions and negotiations going on. It looks like Saudi Arabia has put that on pause for now while the conflict evolves. But I really think you need to think of it as Israel as a pawn in between a larger strategic orientation between the United States and Saudi Arabia that's yet to be finished.
So an alliance against whom then?
Well, if it's an alliance against anyone, it's probably an alliance against Iran. But I don't think you should think of it so much as an alliance against someone, so much as it is the United States trying to put in place a stable balance of power where regional powers can prevent another ISIS from kicking off, or prevent all the kinds of chaos that we've seen from the Middle East for decades. The ironic thing here is that the United States was the one that destroyed the balance of power in the first place by knocking out Saddam Hussein, who was a terrible person and whose regime did terrible things. But by knocking them out, you destroyed the balance of power. You basically opened up Iran's avenue, technically all the way to the Mediterranean, because Iraq was that main balancing force against Iran. So in some ways, the United States is trying to fix the mistake that it made in Iraq all those years ago. And the more it seems to try to fix it, the more things seem to spiral out of control. And the last thing I'll say on this is, in some ways, it doesn't make sense. It's an anachronism, because even go back 20 years or go back to 73, which a lot of people are comparing this conflict to, the United States was dependent on the region for oil. The United States was importing oil from Saudi Arabia. If you cut off Middle East oil from the United States 20 years ago or 30 years ago, you were dealing a real blow to the U.S. economy. That's not true anymore. The United States has enough oil on its own. It only imports from the Gulf now because it's trying to make them happy, and it's not in very high amounts. The power that is really dependent on those oil exports out of the Gulf is China. So everybody thinks that China is sort of, part of this, or maybe they're part of some China, Russian, Iranian conspiracy. I bet the Chinese are terrified of any kind of escalation, which means that oil flow out of the Strait of Hormuz, for example, gets blocked off, because they are dependent on those oil imports in the same way that the United States was in 73, in the same way that it was when it was thinking about the Second Iraq War.
Fascinating. When we and I hate to compare conflicts, but it's just they're all happening in parallel, and so it's sort of the default. While we see, at least in the U.S. for sure, polls showing people being tired of you providing financial support to Ukraine, it seems that, at least initially here, whatever Israel needs, Israel is going to get financially. Can you just explain the difference there?
Well, you can sort of, well, let me take a step back.
Yeah,
so
go ahead.
You and I have talked before about a multipolar world, and that's sort of an abstract concept. Oh, rising and falling great powers. This sounds like a game of Risk. Here's a place where you have a tangible, concrete example. So in a world where the United States is the overwhelming dominant military economic power, it can do whatever it wants. It can support Ukraine, and it can support Israel, and it can support the Philippines and the South China Sea, which is having its own tussle with China right now, which has been sort of shoved underneath the headlines. And it can do all those things and doesn't have to worry. The United States can't do that anymore. It cannot be all things to all people or all countries. So if it tries to spread itself too thin, if it supports Ukraine and Israel and the Philippines, and you have 3 different conflicts going on at the same time, the United States is not omnipotent, even if it is still the most powerful country in the world. It doesn't have the resources to do all of this. So I think the United States is reflexively thinking of itself as still that dominant power where it doesn't have these rivals. And yes, it's going to support Ukraine and it's going to support Israel and it's going to go to the hilt. But I think Washington is hurtling towards this point where it's not going to have the resources to do everything that the old policy point of view would do. And I think we're going to have to get to a point in the United States where you prioritize, well, which conflicts are strategic and which conflicts will the American people support in subsequent elections. That's not all in there right now. You still have Washington, I think, behaving as if, oh, the United States is the leader of the world. We have this, light versus dark, freedom versus tyranny. Like all these things are still there. And I'm just not sure that works in a multipolar world where the United States is not as powerful as it used to be.
You mentioned that the most likely outcome is this situation in Israel remains a regional conflict. What lead? I guess at this point, is there a path that we see that ends this for the time being? Not ends it, because this has been going on for a long time. But where we sort of put the guns down for a little while. Like what creates that situation?
Well, I think the problem here is the party that doesn't want to end this conflict and that wants it to escalate is Hamas. And I think Hamas is the one holding the keys to ending it. If Hamas released all the hostages tomorrow, I think you would see U.S. support and public support for Israel's invasion of the Gaza Strip evaporate overnight. But as long as those hostages are there, there's going to be a political imperative on the Israeli government to exact a cost. And there's also an imperative for the Israeli government to, I don't think they'll ever reestablish deterrence, but to make the country secure again. Israelis don't feel secure, and it's not just in the south, it's also in the north. They've been evacuating towns on the Lebanese border because of what Hezbollah is doing as well. So if they keep all the hostages and Israel goes in force, which is probably what Hamas wants, then it really becomes a guessing game about Iran's intentions and U.S. intentions. If Israel kills, let's hypothetical, 50,000, 100,000 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and if it attacks Hezbollah positions preemptively in Lebanon and kills, let's say thousands of Hezbollah fighters and maybe thousands of Lebanese civilians die in the crossfire, does Iran look at the 2 carrier battle groups from the United States there and say, we don't really want to tussle with this right now? Like our proxy went a little bit off the chain. We didn't think we were going to be this successful. We don't want a big regional conflict. Or is Iran going to say, we built up these proxies. We have to defend them. We have to show that we're tough. This is an opportunity for us to push back against U.S. interests in the region and deploy all of our cards. And then as the United States, as it has been reported that the United States has said to Israel, if Hezbollah attacks you, the United States will help. The United States will help defend you. Israel is one of our allies. So that's that escalatory scenario. Yeah. But yeah, the answer to your question is, I think the guns go silent if the hostages are released. Okay. I don't think that's going to happen.
You have to think, like you mentioned Iraq earlier. You have to think for both the U.S. and for Iran that what happened in Iraq is like a very sober reminder. So, from the U.S. standpoint, regime change doesn't always, there's unintended consequences of that. And that solving it's just not that simple. And for Iran, it's like, saw how Iraq got run over. Don't want that to happen. It's you push it to the edge, but let's not cross the line where the U.S. says regime change. Is that fair?
Iran, Iran is a much more powerful country, and it would take a lot more U.S. resources to do what you're talking about
Okay.
for regime change in Tehran. Saddam Hussein was a Sunni thug in a country that was majority Shiite. And so there was already sort of a built-in, and not even to get into the Kurdish population in Iraq. Iraq is a very sort of special case there. The United States isn't, even if it marshaled the same amount of force that it marshaled with Iraq, I think it would have a very, very hard time doing the same sort of thing to Iran. I think you actually have it wrong. For the United States, Iraq is a cautionary tale. For Iran, U.S. engagement in the region is wonderful. Iraq's collapse meant that Iran got to be the primary influencer in Iraq because it used its Shiite ties with the majority Shiite population to build a closer relationship. It's what opened the supply lines to Syria and all the way out to Lebanon and allowed them to create the so-called Shiite crescent that expanded their geopolitical influence into the Mediterranean, and which is what the United States has been trying to push against ever since. So there's an argument to be made there that if Iran can attract the U.S. into the region in some of these fights, but not have the U.S. focus on Iran itself, that probably serves Iran's purposes, because the more the U.S. messes things up, the more power vacuums that are there. That has generally been a good thing for Iran because they come in and fill the power vacuum, and it helps their geopolitical interests.
Any updates to what's happening with Ukraine and Russia, or is it just sort of moving into the dog days of that war?
Well, I don't know. This is also an interesting question. I think the assumption is that once you get to winter, the fighting is going to slow down or stop. But Ukraine has been warning the last couple of days that actually Russia seems to be gearing up for a winter offensive. And I'm not sure exactly what that looks like. But there was a Russian offensive near Donetsk province, or in Donetsk, I should say, in the last couple of weeks that looked somewhat successful at first, but now it looks like they're getting a lot of casualties. You had Ukraine last week apparently got to the left bank of the Dnipro river with some of their forces. Maybe that was going to be a bridgehead to helping them cut off the Crimea. They haven't really made much progress there. And then I think the bigger news for Ukraine is that it looks like the European Union is not close to meeting its pledges on providing ammunition for Ukraine. And then you also had Slovakia's new prime minister come out and say Slovakia is no longer going to give military aid to Ukraine in the future. It wants the European Union to be a peaceful entity, not a war entity. So you put all that together, I think you can see that the Russian strategy here is probably attrition. Make the Ukrainians use all the ammunition, get into fights where the Russians can take more casualties than the Ukrainians, and bet that eventually Ukraine and eventually the West will get tired of the conflict. And for Ukraine, the goal, I think, has to be cut off the supply lines to Crimea and then consolidate your position inside of Ukraine in a somewhat defensible area. And, it's October 26th here. The Ukrainian counteroffensive has been ongoing since the summer. They don't look that much closer to cutting off Russia from Crimea than they did at the beginning of the summer. And there's still time to go. And as I mentioned, there are still operations happening that maybe they will have some success. But I think it's been a failed counteroffensive so far for Ukraine. And if you continue on this path, Russia is the one that is not going to leave. They're going, as I think I said to you before, Russia's going to gamble that it can outsuffer everybody else until nobody else is remaining in the conflict. And I think that's all they really have left to play for.
And is there a really cold side to the, because I can't remember if it was you that had said it or I heard it somewhere else, where basically this last round of funding from Europe and the US that went to Ukraine, there was pressure we need to see some wins here, some movement forward. And you're telling me that maybe necessarily has not happened. Does that increase the probability, actually, the lack of military success from Ukraine's standpoint actually accelerates funds being cut off and people kind of walking away from them? Or is that really cold?
That depends. I don't think the Biden administration is going to cut off the funds. They'll use executive power in the United States, no matter what the polls are showing them, no matter what Congress is doing. The U.S. election, if Biden loses and you get a Republican in the office who doesn't want to send all that support to Ukraine, that's something they need to worry about, and they're probably worried about that timeline. Europe is a different story. And Europe, it seems to me that Germany and France are still very, very committed to Ukraine's efforts. The problem is that they're not executing at the level that they said they would, and Ukraine needs them to execute on that level, or Ukraine's not going to have the ammunition needs to fire. And then they'll either have to change the way that they're fighting, or they'll have to figure out how to make that ammunition themselves. But in general, poll numbers in both Europe and the United States have been declining for Ukraine. And I don't think anybody wants to be sort of interminably funding Ukraine going forward. The last thing I'll just say is Ukraine knows this. So a couple months ago, they were talking about how, okay, we need to get as much defense investment as we can here as possible, because we have to build the weapons and repair the tanks and do all the things here, because we can't count on everybody indefinitely. And you have especially European defense companies that are salivating at the prospect, because they're not making guns for the German army, but in Ukraine, there's an active war. So I think there's a European interest in Ukraine winning the war and in Ukraine joining the EU eventually. And I think that's where Zelensky has to have the most hope. If I had him here next to me and I was advising him, I would tell him, your worst case scenario that you need to plan for is that on November 4th or whenever the US election is, you could very, very easily be dealing with a much less supportive United States. And you need to figure out if you can continue on your path with your resources without the United States supporting you as much as you have before. That's a very real scenario Ukraine needs to worry about.
Yeah, if anybody was watching the Republicans try to pick a Speaker of the House, that that should be a bit of a sign, and if you're paying attention to that, the writing may be on the wall with where that goes next November. I did find it interesting. Mitch McConnell said earlier this week, one of the misunderstandings about some of that funding for Ukraine is that it actually stays in the United. So I never thought of it this way. You think if it's like this check that is shipped, via UPS over to Ukraine, but some of that money just stays actually in the U.S. and goes to basically the manufacturing of weapons domestically in the U.S. and then those weapons are what are exported. I thought it was interesting he was making that point.
Well, yeah, and also, we're sort of getting to the point where the United States also doesn't have the capacity to produce the ammunition and weapons that are needed at the scale that Ukraine needs them. Up until now, the United States has basically been raiding old warehouses of weapons they thought they were going to use in the Cold War and didn't. So this was great. Now you get to ship the old weapons over to Ukraine and they get used and, you get some kind of return. But now we're reaching the points, and this goes back to your point about can you support Ukraine and Israel at the same time? The United States is not on a war economy. United States defense companies can't keep up this pace, but the pace that the Ukrainians are using them at, let alone, the weapons that Israel is asking for too. And again, I would just highlight for listeners, like, a Philippine ship and a Chinese ship collided in the South China Sea earlier this week, and both sides are accusing the other side of each other. And Biden came out, we're recording on Thursday, he came out today and said that the United States would defend the Philippines in case of a Chinese attack. That's a nice statement, but which carrier battle group with what weapons? Like, I don't think that scenario is going to happen, but I'm just saying you start putting the things on the map. There's a real difference between what U.S. policymakers think they can do and want to do versus what are the constraints of what you actually have.
And hey, countries like Canada don't have the resources that they don't exactly. Canada's not been committed to having a strong military to provide assistance. So that's like that's one of the problems here too.
Well, again, that depends what your strategic objectives are. If your goal is to be the global hegemon and to enforce a rules-based, international order, yes, you better spend a lot of money on the military and you better be able to back up your threats with military force. Canada, as far as I know, is not doing that. It's not trying to be a global policeman or aspire to global power. And in that case, if what Canada is doing is saying our military forces are designed to protect Canadian national interests, well, as long as you can protect your borders and not get invaded by somebody else, that technically ticks the box. So, that's a larger policy question, and there are, pros and cons on both sides. But this, again, it goes back to the United States has gone from does it have the military force to protect itself to does it have the military force to be the most powerful country in the world enforcing a rules-based order that is run from Washington. Those are two very different things. And because you have rising powers like China or revisionist powers like Russia, like, are you able to have enough military capacity to put down those types of things? Do you have the political will to fight against those things? And what is the actual relationship of that to U.S. national security interests? To go back to where we started, you talked about how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict seems to hit so close to home, especially in the United States, but, in English-speaking parts of the world in general. It's not clear to me that it's strategically important. I don't like saying that. It doesn't make me feel particularly good. But what is the existential threat to the United States if something bad happens to Israel? This is not the Cold War anymore. This is not, dueling with the Soviet Union and containment in the Middle East and communism versus capitalism, which is where the U.S. Israel special relationship begins. The U.S. and Israel actually had a combative relationship as recently as 1956, when Israel invaded Egypt with Britain and France, and it was the Eisenhower administration that came in and said, no, don't do that. Go back home. Give the Suez back to the Egyptians. So it's strange how fast these things can change.
Jacob, let's finish up with this. What's a geopolitical situation happening in the world that people aren't spending a lot of time talking about, or maybe not even aware of is happening and should be?
I think the way I'm going to answer that question is there is so much doom and gloom out there, and there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of disruption, but I think we're all consuming doom and gloom the same way we consume candy or fast food. It sort of gives us a rush, and then we want more of it. There's actually a lot of good stuff happening in the world too. If you look at the scientific advances we're making in places like biotech or materials or energy, I mean, we're like, they're fascinating. And from, I work at Cognitive Investments. From an investment point of view, usually disruption in this sort of thing drives tremendous tech innovation. And we haven't had tremendous tech innovation for 20 or 30 years. It's just, iPhone 15, iPhone 30, it's got a new camera, it's got a new this. I think we're on the cusp of some really interesting technologies and of increasing productivity and all these other sorts of things. So I think it's easy to get down in the weeds and say, oh my God, the world is going to hell in a handbasket. But I actually don't think it is. I actually think when you actually, there are these brush fires in different places around the world, but I don't see any global conflict happening anytime soon. And, in some of those sectors that I mentioned, or if you're in agriculture too, like it's an amazing time, I think, to be in agriculture, to reimagine what agriculture looks like. At a time when people are now worried more about resilience and quality rather than just in time and get it there as cheap as possible and produce more. If it's an opportunity for tech companies, it's also an opportunity for farmers. I often tell, when I speak to farmer audiences, I say, look at what the tech companies are doing and maybe think about how that could be reflected in your strategy rather than just doing what you were doing before. Because I guarantee you, they're not doing what they were doing before. Follow the smart money.
Great stuff. Jacob, as always, great insights. Really, really appreciate it. This has been another episode of Frontlines, and Jacob, we'll talk to you again in a month.
Sounds good. I hope it's a little more boring in a month.